In the deep lowlands of Central America, the jungle does not roar. It breathes. Morning light drips slowly through leaves, touching stone with the same patience it has held for centuries. Great plazas wait beneath vines, cleared only by rain and wind, their symmetry still intact. Stairways rise toward temples aligned with stars that no longer receive prayers. There is no smoke, no broken walls, no echo of panic. Only space, only absence. Tikal stands like this. Copán, Calakmul, cities complete in form, yet emptied of people. They linger in silence, daring visitors to listen rather than look closely now. These places were not ruined in war. No enemy torched their archives or shattered their thrones. There are no mass graves at their gates, no weapons scattered where defenders fell. Archaeologists did not find a final day frozen in violence. They found order. Homes were not overturned. Tools were set down, not dropped. Carvings remain unfinished, not smashed. It is as if life paused, inhaled, and never exhaled again. The silence feels intentional, unsettling, heavier than destruction ever could. Such absence invites questions history, rarely prepares us to answer quietly, especially when greatness simply stops without warning, explanation, or aftermath. Most histories teach collapse as spectacle. Cities burn, armies clash, empires scream as they die. We are trained to look for endings shaped by force because they feel dramatic and complete. The Maya offer something far more disturbing. Their cities did not fall outward. They emptied inward. Temples remained sacred, but unattended. Roads stayed aligned but quiet. Power structures existed, but were no longer obeyed. Whatever happened here did not announce itself. It crept. It waited. It convinced an entire world to loosen its grip without force, without flames, without a single decisive moment that history would later remember clearly. This quiet ending forces a dangerous question almost immediately. What kind of society leaves no final cry? The Maya were not weak, primitive, or isolated. They were engineers of time, readers of the sky, architects of entire landscapes. Their rulers spoke with gods, or claimed to. Their calendars could see centuries ahead. If any civilization believed itself eternal, it was this one. And yet, when the moment came, they did not fight to remain. They stepped back, leaving stone to stand alone. That decision lingers like a shadow across everything we think we know about the nature of collapse itself. Across the plazas, details whisper instead of shout. A stela carved halfway through a royal name. A stone tool resting where a hand last placed it. Homes cleared of trash, but not stripped in haste. These are not the marks of panic. They suggest time to think, to choose, to prepare. Generation by generation, something shifted. Not a single disaster, but a gathering understanding. The world they had built no longer returned what it demanded, so they stopped feeding it with their lives. Power faded quietly, taking obedience, faith, and urgency with it over time, not overnight. Slowly, patiently, surely. The most unsettling possibility now enters the room. What if the Maya did not lose their cities at all? What if they evaluated them, weighed their cost, and chose to leave? Abandonment sounds like defeat, because we are taught to worship permanence. But survival does not always mean holding ground. Sometimes it means walking away while walking is still possible. This story begins by suggesting something uncomfortable. The Maya collapse may have been a rational decision, not a tragic surprise. That idea alone unsettles everything. Traditional history promises audiences who expect drama, enemies, heroes, and clear endings shaped by violence. This documentary does not begin with answers, because the Maya did not leave us any. They left spaces. Questions shaped like plazas, gaps shaped like stairways to nowhere. To stand in these cities today is to feel watched by absence itself. The jungle presses close, but never quite touches everything. Stone still breathes, silence still waits. Whatever pushed people away from these centers of power did not destroy belief overnight. It persuaded families, slowly, that life belonged elsewhere. Leaving was not sudden. It was taught, repeated, and eventually normalized through seasons, failures, and quiet disappointments that accumulated over time together. The absence of catastrophe is precisely why this mystery endures. Fire leaves evidence, war leaves bones, silence leaves interpretation. Scholars have argued for centuries, often searching for a single moment to blame, but no such moment appears. Instead, the Maya story dissolves neatly into uncertainty. It refuses drama. It resists closure. And because of that, it invites us closer, asking not how a city dies, but why living inside it stopped making sense. That question lingers uncomfortably, especially when mirrored against our own creations, cities we assume permanent, systems we trust unquestioningly, futures we rarely consider walking away from willingly. To understand this choice, we cannot rush forward. We must listen backward, toward noise instead of quiet, toward markets filled with voices, rituals thick with meaning, rulers convinced of divine order. The silence only makes sense once we hear what came before it, once we understand what kind of civilization could afford to leave without running, and why leaving felt safer than staying when the world stopped responding. What follows is not a tale of sudden ruin, but of accumulating doubt. Before the cities emptied, they were full of sound, color, certainty, and routine. To understand why they became quiet, we must enter that noise again. The silence has shown us the ending. Now the story must return to movement, ambition, and faith, to reveal how a civilization strong enough to map the heavens learned, slowly, to let itself go. We return now to a time before the silence, when the Maya world was loud with purpose. Cities rose from forest clearings not as accidents of growth, but as deliberate visions shaped by belief. Stone reflected sky. Streets followed stars. Every plaza, stair, and altar fit within a larger pattern that promised order, meaning, and endurance far beyond the span of a single human life. Here, nothing existed without intention, and nothing felt temporary or uncertain to those living there. At their height, Maya cities were among the most sophisticated environments on Earth. They measured time with calendars so precise they could track eclipses centuries ahead. Mathematicians used zero long before it appeared elsewhere, allowing calculation, prediction, and planning on astonishing scales. Architecture rose without metal blades or animals pulling loads, shaped instead by patience, geometry, and communal labor, guided by ritual knowledge passed forward carefully. Nothing here was improvised. Each stone followed inherited rules. Each measurement mirrored cycles observed in the heavens. And builders worked not for speed, but for alignment with forces believed to govern existence itself. Through repetition and memory, the cities became physical expressions of cosmic confidence. Shared knowledge made permanence feel achievable. For many generations, these were not chaotic settlements clinging to survival. Maya cities operated through rhythm and routine, where ceremony structured time as surely as the sun's path. Rulers did not govern by force alone. They governed by meaning. Kings served as living bridges between the human world and unseen powers believed to shape rain, harvest, and destiny. Through ritual performance, they claimed responsibility for balance itself, assuring communities that the universe remained attentive. As long as rites continued and cycles were honored, stability seemed not only possible, but guaranteed. Power flowed downward through belief, upward through trust, creating a system that reinforced itself quietly. For centuries, nothing challenged these assumptions deeply enough to break them. They felt timeless, secure, inevitable. To everyone, stability defined the Maya experience of history. Dynasties endured across generations, their names carved repeatedly into stone as proof of continuity. Astronomical records survived centuries, refined rather than replaced. Knowledge accumulated instead of resetting. The present always rested upon an honored past. A farmer worked land his ancestors had shaped. A priest followed chants refined by countless voices before him. This continuity created confidence that tomorrow would resemble yesterday, only slightly improved. Such faith encouraged expansion, growth, and devotion, because limits felt distant when time itself appeared orderly and obedient. In this environment, abandonment seemed unthinkable, even absurd, to those invested fully in its promise. Nothing about daily life suggested an ending existed ahead. The system appeared complete and correcting. Yet permanence demanded balance, and balance required constant input. Rituals consumed time, labor, and resources drawn from the land. Fields expanded outward. Forests retreated subtly. Populations grew within carefully managed limits that felt safe because they had always been respected. Nothing in this process felt urgent. Adjustments happened gradually, masked by success and repetition. When harvests met expectations, the system appeared justified, even wise. Complex systems often feel strongest just before stress reveals weakness, and the Maya were no exception. Every achievement depended on conditions remaining stable, and stability is fragile when unseen pressures accumulate quietly. Still, from the inside, life felt ordered, predictable, and endlessly repeating in reassuring cycles. Doubt had not yet found its voice. Within the cities, this is why abandonment feels so unsettling in hindsight. The Maya built systems meant to outlast individuals, rulers, and even generations. Everything important was designed to repeat rather than fall apart, to endure rather than rush forward carelessly. That history would later label their cities abandoned suggests a failure of language more than behavior. Leaving contradicts our preference for dramatic endings, especially when no conqueror claims victory. We struggle to understand choices made without panic because they deny the spectacle we expect history to provide us. The Maya teach an uncomfortable truth. Endurance can include departure. Sometimes civilizations survive by changing shape instead of clinging to monuments. That possibility reframes everything we think we know, about collapse and success, alike. For now, however, the world still feels whole. The philosophies, calendars, and customs hold. Children learn the same stories their grandparents trusted. Priests repeat chants, proven reliable by time. Builders follow blueprints written in sky and stone. There is no sense of approaching end. Confidence rests not in speed or force, but in continuity and alignment with unseen rhythms, believed dependable. If fracture exists, it is invisible, hidden within success itself, where complexity quietly multiplies demands faster than balance can answer. The system works beautifully, but only because every part continues doing exactly what it always has. Change has not yet announced its presence, and comfort still feels justified. The future appears mapped, measured, and obedient. To expectation, for everyone. But perfection carries weight. Systems built for harmony rely on every layer remaining intact. When small pressures emerge, they are often mistaken for temporary noise rather than warning. The Maya world is approaching this moment, though no one recognizes it yet. Balance still holds, but strain has begun moving beneath the surface. Success has quietly increased dependence on rituals, land, leadership, and predictability, turning stability into something that must be continuously defended. The audience senses this unknowingly, feeling admiration slowly tinged with unease as perfection begins to feel demanding. Not every system fails by breaking. Some fail by asking too much for too long. The Maya story edges quietly toward that threshold, without yet knowing its cost or consequences ahead. With the civilization fully formed in our view, the question shifts subtly. How does something so carefully designed begin feeling heavy to those inside it? The answer does not arrive with fire or invasion. It arrives quietly, through almost invisible fractures that perfection itself creates. From here, the story moves forward not to chaos, but to the first signs of pressure, waiting patiently to be noticed. This prepares us to search for causes rather than endings, in what follows next. For a long time, growth felt like proof that everything was working. Maya cities expanded the way living things do, outward and steadily, responding to confidence rather than fear. New homes rose beyond ceremonial centers. Fields replaced forest edges. Causeways stretched farther, tying districts together like veins extending from a healthy heart. Each addition seemed reasonable, even necessary. More people meant more labor. More labor meant larger temples, more rituals, stronger ties between rulers and the heavens. At first, growth looked like harmony in motion, the physical sign of a civilization fulfilling its promise to endure. To support this expansion, the Maya reshaped the land with extraordinary skill. Hillsides became terraces that slowed erosion and captured soil. Reservoirs collected rainwater during wet months, releasing it carefully when the dry season lingered. Canals redirected flow. Wetlands were engineered into productive fields. These solutions worked so well, they encouraged reliance. Each success quieted concerns about limits, reinforcing belief that knowledge and coordination could overcome anything nature withheld. Ingenuity became insurance. The land responded, harvests continued, and cities swelled with life. From within, there was no reason to question progress. It felt measured, deliberate, under control. Daily life adjusted almost imperceptibly as demands increased. Farmers spent longer hours coaxing yields from fields now asked to give more than before. Forests retreated farther from city edges, making wood harder to gather. Nobles required additional tribute to sustain rituals that had grown larger and more frequent, designed to reassure hearts unsettled by minor inconsistencies in weather or harvest timing. Craftspeople worked harder to meet expectations placed upon beauty and ceremony. None of this felt like crisis. It felt like responsibility. Each person contributed slightly more, trusting that the system knew what it was doing, just as it always had. Effort became normal. Fatigue did not register as warning yet. What makes this stage difficult to recognize as danger is its calm. No records describe panic or desperation. Archaeological traces show continuity rather than disruption. Homes stay occupied. Tools remain refined. The system adapts smoothly, absorbing strain without visible fracture. Yet, beneath that composure, balance grows thinner. Soils show subtle exhaustion. Fields produce reliably, but not richly. Recovery after dry periods takes longer. Small adjustments are required to maintain familiar outcomes. Complexity deepens quietly, weaving new dependencies into everyday survival. Each improvement becomes another component that cannot fail without consequences rippling outward. Stability now depends on everything working at once, especially when pressure accumulates silently. Solving problems encourages confidence, but it can also disguise the cost of solutions. Terraces require maintenance. Reservoirs demand labor. Canals silt without clearing. The more elaborate the system becomes, the less room it leaves for interruption. Resilience begins to rely on constant attention rather than natural margin. When success demands continuous effort, rest disappears slowly, unnoticed, until recovery itself becomes difficult. The Maya did not overreach suddenly. They adjusted endlessly, refining systems that supported growth while quietly consuming flexibility. What once felt efficient gradually became essential. This is how traps form, not through mistakes, but through solutions that work too well for too long. Archaeology confirms this quiet intensification. Evidence shows repeated use of the same land without sufficient fallow periods. Chemical traces reveal declining soil vitality. Not collapse, but steady depletion managed through labor instead of recovery. Building programs expand even as resources thin, not because leaders are blind, but because each project reinforces authority and belief. When uncertainty emerges, the response is not restraint. It is investment. Build more, dig deeper, expand reach. Each action preserves stability in the short term, while tightening its requirements in the long term. No single choice feels wrong. Together, they leave little space to breathe. From inside the Maya world, the system probably felt busier, not broken. More festivals, more coordination, more responsibility layered onto familiar routines. Children grew into roles that demanded greater effort than those their parents remembered, yet inherited explanations that framed this as duty rather than warning. The city still functioned, markets still filled. The sky still followed known patterns most of the time. Nothing announced failure. Everything insisted on continuation. This is how strain hides behind functionality, convincing societies they are safe so long as motion continues. Stillness would have revealed weakness. Movement concealed it perfectly. What becomes clear only in hindsight is that the Maya were not merely growing. They were using tomorrow to pay for today. Their success leaned increasingly on uninterrupted cycles of rain, labor, belief, and coordination. As long as nothing disrupted the rhythm, the illusion of balance held. But systems like this grow sensitive. They tolerate strain poorly once pushed beyond a certain threshold. The danger was not collapse, but dependency. When effort replaces margin, even small disruptions feel large. Yet, at this stage, disruption has not arrived. Only pressure, faint and easily dismissed, like tension beneath familiar music no one thinks to stop or question quietly. This is the moment before awareness. The system has not failed. It has become heavy. Growth, once celebration, now binds every part together more tightly than before. The Maya do not notice themselves becoming trapped by success, because the trap feels like prosperity. To recognize it would require perspective unavailable from within daily life. So they continue forward, adding layers, trusting systems, proven reliable. But pressure does not resolve itself. It travels upward and outward, seeking release. As land and labor grow strained, attention inevitably turns toward power, toward rulers whose authority rests upon results that must never falter. The next stage begins there. In the Maya world, leadership was never merely administrative. Kings did not rule simply by commanding people, they ruled by persuading the universe. Their authority rested on a delicate promise, that through proper ritual, timing, and sacrifice, they could maintain harmony between the human realm and the forces that governed rain, crops, and time itself. A king was not just a ruler. He was a living instrument, tuned to cosmic order, expected to keep the world functioning as it always had. As long as balance held, belief held with it. Monuments carved across Maya cities tell this story clearly. Inscriptions celebrate not only victories over rivals, but triumphs over time, drought, and disorder. Kings marked eclipses, calendar endings, anniversaries of divine descent. Their reigns were framed as chapters in a much larger book written by the heavens. By documenting alignment with sacred cycles, rulers reassured their people that nothing had slipped beyond control. The future felt governed, not uncertain. Stability flowed outward from ceremony into daily life, anchoring trust in stone, ceremony, and repetition. As long as rituals worked, authority remained unquestioned. Faith was infrastructure, invisible but essential. As pressures on land and labor grew quietly, expectations placed upon kings intensified without formal acknowledgement. If rains were late or harvests thinner, the answer was rarely doubt. It was redoubling belief. Ritual calendars expanded. Ceremonies were held more frequently, layered more densely, as if volume could compensate for uncertainty. Monuments rose larger, taller, more elaborate, reinforcing the image of power at the very moment it was under strain. From the outside, this can resemble excess. From the inside, it was maintenance. Leaders were not indulging. They were trying to preserve a system whose authority depended entirely on visible success. This escalation created a dangerous feedback loop. Each public ritual reaffirmed the king's role as cosmic mediator, but also increased the cost of failure. When rains arrived, relief reinforced belief. When they did not, explanation grew complicated. The universe was not wrong, something else must be. More offerings, more bloodletting, more alignment. A delayed harvest did not suggest mismanagement. It suggested imbalance, and imbalance threatened everyone, not just those in power. Responsibility for stability, spread across the population, bound tightly to the actions of a few sacred figures whose performance now mattered more than ever. Unlike modern authority, failure here was never private. A misaligned ritual, an unanswered plea, or a promised outcome delayed too long was not interpreted as a simple mistake. It rippled outward as existential anxiety. If the gods did not respond, perhaps they were displeased. If they were displeased, perhaps order itself was weakening. Kings felt this pressure intensely. Their legitimacy rested on reliability, not force. Fear of appearing disconnected from the cosmos likely shaped decisions as much as confidence ever had. Strength became performance, certainty became theatre. And beneath it all, doubt waited, faint but persistent, like a crack no one dared name aloud. Archaeological clues hint at this shifting mood. Ritual spaces multiply. Stelae cluster closer together in time, as if reassurance needed constant renewal. Iconography emphasizes renewal, rebirth, continuity, concepts pointing subtly against anxiety rather than celebration. Kings portrayed themselves engaged endlessly in sacred acts, wearing symbols that linked them ever more tightly to divine cycles. The message was clear. Control remained intact, yet repetition itself can signal insecurity. When statements become louder, it is often because silence no longer feels safe. Faith, once effortless, required reinforcement. Authority asked to be seen constantly, because invisibility now carried risk. At the heart of this tension lay an impossible expectation. Kings were asked to guarantee outcomes no human can promise. Weather, soil recovery, population balance, forest regrowth. These exist beyond ritual command, regardless of belief. but stepping away from such promises would have meant unraveling the moral foundation of rule itself. So leaders did what systems often do under pressure. They leaned harder into the logic that built them. More ceremony, more monuments, more reassurance. Confidence became compulsory. Doubt remained unspoken, but widely felt. The system did not break loudly. It tightened. For ordinary people, the strain manifested subtly. When rituals multiplied but results wavered, trust began drifting inward. Not toward rebellion yet, but toward questioning. People noticed longer waits for rain. They noticed fields needing more effort. They participated faithfully, yet began quietly recalibrating expectations. The king still spoke with the gods, but the gods were slower now, less predictable. This gap between promise and outcome did not spark immediate collapse. Instead, it eroded certainty gently, one season at a time. The universe had not rejected the Maya outright. It had become inconsistent. And inconsistency is far more unsettling than disaster. This moment marks a critical shift. Belief still functions, but no longer effortlessly. Authority still stands, but no longer unquestioned. The cosmic order remains intact, but its responsiveness feels delayed, uneven, strained. For a civilization built on cycles, delay itself becomes a warning. Time stops behaving politely. Seasons slip. Patterns hesitate. Kings remain visible, commanding devotion, but the sensation beneath the surface has changed. Faith is bearing weight it was never meant to carry alone, and when belief carries too much, it bends, sometimes silently, sometimes before anyone admits it has bent at all. What matters most is that no one yet names this as failure. The system remains operational, impressive, intimidating even. From a distance, Maya civilization still appears powerful, confident, divinely protected. But inside, the cost of maintaining that image is rising. Leaders sense it. People feel it. The environment will soon make it undeniable. Belief has begun to crack, not shatter, and that fracture opens space for forces beyond ritual to assert themselves. The stage is set for a test that no ceremony, however elaborate, can postpone any longer, as the land itself prepares to answer expectations with silence. Long after the cities fell silent, the earth itself kept a record, not in words or carvings, but in layers. At the bottoms of lakes, thin bands of sediment stacked year upon year, marking wet seasons and dry ones without judgment. Inside caves, mineral drips hardened into stone columns, each layer formed by moisture that arrived on time, or did not. In these quiet archives, scholars centuries later would read a story the Maya never wrote down, a story not of sudden ruin, but of repetition, of rain that came late, then lighter, then failed altogether for stretches too long to ignore. What makes this threat so difficult to grasp is how gently it announced itself. There was no single year when the sky closed forever, no moment people could point to and say, "This is when everything changed." The danger arrived as absence, a missing storm, a dry spell that lingered a little longer than expected. Reservoirs did not empty at once. They lowered slowly, season by season, enough to cause concern but not panic. Crops did not vanish overnight. They underperformed. Recovery always seemed possible, just one good season away. And for a time, that hope was justified. Rain did return, then it faltered again. Scientific evidence now shows these patterns clearly. Isotope ratios captured in stone reveal prolonged drought cycles repeating across generations. Lake beds record thinning layers where water once pooled deeply. These signals do not describe apocalypse, they describe inconsistency. A climate growing less reliable, more demanding, harder to predict. For people whose lives depended on cycles, unpredictability itself was destabilizing. The Maya were not strangers to dry seasons. They managed them skillfully. What changed was duration. One drought can be endured. Several in succession begin to alter expectations. Planning becomes difficult. Confidence strains. Still, none of this felt immediately fatal. It felt inconvenient, manageable, temporary. The Maya responded the way any capable society would. They adapted. Reservoirs were expanded, storage increased, agricultural methods adjusted. Rituals intensified, aligning prayers with increasingly precise timings. Each response worked just enough to reinforce the belief that control remained possible. No one wakes one morning and abandons certainty. It erodes gradually, disguised by partial success. A field yields less than before, but still feeds families. A reservoir reaches its lowest point, but refills eventually. These near misses encouraged effort, not retreat. They suggested the system needed more care, not reconsideration, and so care increased. Yet each dry cycle left behind something invisible: margin. The space between hardship and catastrophe narrowed. Recovery after drought took longer. Soils returned less fertile. Water systems demanded more labor to deliver the same results. These losses did not appear dramatic enough to record publicly, but they accumulated quietly in experience. People noticed new fragility long before historians ever would. They noticed how close survival sometimes felt. Not dire, but tight. And tightness breeds vigilance. Vigilance becomes exhaustion. Still, nothing exploded. Nothing forced acknowledgement. The climate did not shout. It whispered, repeating the same message in a language only patience reveals. What makes prolonged drought uniquely dangerous is how it disguises limits. Storms are obvious. Floods demand immediate response. Absence invites interpretation. One dry season feels like misfortune. Several feel like test. Many spread across decades feel like burden, but one people believe they can outlast. The Maya trusted cycles deeply. They trusted that patience would be rewarded, that harmony could be restored through persistence. But nature was no longer negotiating on familiar terms. Seasons slipped out of rhythm. Patterns hesitated. Reliability thinned until planning felt strained rather than reassuring. Yet belief persisted, because belief had sustained them through hardship before. Archaeological evidence suggests this period did not trigger mass panic or flight. There are no signs of cities emptying suddenly in response to drought alone. Instead, life continued under increasing strain. New construction still occurred. Rituals intensified rather than diminished. People acted as though solutions were working, because partially they were. That partial success may have delayed recognition of danger more effectively than outright failure would have. As long as adaptation produced results, even diminishing ones, reconsideration felt unnecessary. Effort replaced margin. Work replaced abundance. These substitutions function until they exhaust the system providing them. Over generations, children grew up knowing climates slightly harsher than their grandparents remembered. That normalization made it harder to see change as emergency. It was simply how life felt now. Hotter, drier, more demanding. This slow shift is why the threat feels so haunting in hindsight. There was no villain, no single error, just a sky that gradually stopped cooperating with expectations shaped by centuries of stability. Nature did not punish the Maya. It ceased accommodating them. That difference matters. It reframes the story as one of misalignment rather than catastrophe. For rulers and priests, the challenge became philosophical as much as practical. Rituals continued. Calendars remained precise. Offerings were made faithfully, yet responses no longer matched effort. When rain failed to arrive, explanations grew fragile. People waited longer. Fields suffered quietly. Confidence thinned without disappearing. This environment placed enormous pressure on belief systems already stretched by growth and complexity. The climate was not hostile in the way invasions are hostile. It offered no enemy to blame, no negotiation table. It simply stopped behaving predictably. And unpredictability destabilizes civilizations built on rhythm more effectively than violence ever could. This is the moment where accumulation reaches awareness. Not panic, but recognition. The realization that adaptation alone may not restore what has been lost. That something larger than ritual, larger than leadership, is reshaping conditions. The Maya had not failed yet. They were still functioning, still working, still believing. But the margin sustaining that belief had thinned dangerously. The environment had delivered its verdict quietly. The next question now loomed heavy and unavoidable. How would a civilization, whose power depended on cosmic cooperation, respond when nature refused to explain itself any longer? As the rains failed to return with confidence, the Maya did not abandon their rituals. They intensified them. Ceremonies grew longer, layered with additional chants, offerings, and symbolic acts meant to reassert cosmic balance. Bloodletting rituals became more demanding, not because cruelty increased, but because sincerity needed to be proven visibly. Kings appeared more frequently before their people, adorned with elaborate regalia that linked them unmistakably to the gods. Temple stairways lengthened. Pyramids rose higher, stone by stone, as though altitude itself might draw the sky closer. Every gesture said the same thing. Order still held, and effort would restore it. Calendars were consulted with urgency bordering on obsession. Specific dates, once marking celebration, now carried the weight of expectation. When an eclipse or cycle passed without relief, interpretation shifted subtly rather than openly. The universe had not failed. The alignment had been incomplete. The response was repetition. Repeat the ritual. Refine it. Perform it again more correctly, more visibly, more often. Failure was inconceivable, because failure implied something far worse than poor planning. It implied a break between humanity and the forces believed to govern existence. So repetition became reassurance, even as results slipped further from reach. The most unsettling aspect revealed by archaeology is not change in ritual form, but its consistency. Ceremonies followed tradition precisely, even as outcomes failed to arrive. There is no evidence of widespread experimentation or abandonment at first. People obeyed longer than logic might suggest. Faith often persists past usefulness because it is woven into identity, community, and meaning. To stop believing would not merely question leadership, it would question reality itself. So belief stretched. It bent under weight it was never designed to carry. Ritual became obligation rather than hope, habit rather than conviction. Disappointment did not arrive dramatically. It seeped. It appeared between successful harvests rather than instead of them. It lived in the space between prayer and result. People noticed patterns without naming them yet. A ritual would be followed by partial improvement, then regression. Relief never lasted long enough to feel secure. Quiet doubt spread unevenly, not as rebellion, but as recalibration. Some communities remained confident longer. Others grew cautious, adjusting expectations downward without formal declaration. Faith did not snap. It thinned, unevenly, across regions and generations. Kings responded by becoming more present, not less. Their visibility increased, along with the frequency of sacred performance. Authority relied on reassurance, and reassurance required spectacle. Monuments multiplied bearing scenes of cosmic control, not to boast, but to remind. Each inscription declared continuity, at a time when continuity felt increasingly fragile. The effort was sincere. Leaders were trapped within the same belief systems as their people. Stepping away from ritual authority would have unmade their role entirely, so they leaned into it, trusting that alignment would eventually return if devotion remained consistent. Yet repetition without results alters psychology. When effort increases while outcome diminishes, trust begins eroding quietly. People do not rebel immediately. They comply while adjusting inwardly, protecting themselves from disappointment by expecting less. Faith shifts from certainty to hope, from hope to habit. Obligation replaces belief without announcement. Ritual attendance continues, but meaning frays at its edges. This change is difficult to detect archaeologically because behavior remains outwardly intact. What dissolves is confidence, something not carved into stone. The Maya story preserves this invisible fracture through absence rather than inscription. Communities responded differently based on experience and environment. Some regions may have received slightly more rain, reinforcing belief longer. Others endured harsher cycles, accelerating doubt. This unevenness prevented unified response. There was no empire-wide moment of realization. There were many small ones, scattered across time and place, a harvest that failed twice rather than once. A ritual that worked before, but not this time. A leader whose confidence felt rehearsed rather than assured. Each moment alone meant little. Together, they trained people to stop expecting guarantees from systems that once promised them. What makes this phase so haunting is its restraint. There is no eruption of anger, no rejection of gods, no sweeping reform. The emotional fracture is quieter than that. It is disappointment, not hatred, not defiance. Disappointment lingers. It exhausts rather than ignites. It convinces people to conserve emotional energy, to comply while protecting themselves internally. Over time, This erodes cohesion more effectively than rebellion ever could. When belief becomes heavy, communities lose the shared trust that binds effort together. Ritual turns inward, focused on preserving order locally rather than universally. Collective identity begins to weaken. Still, the world does not yet collapse. Cities remain occupied, markets function, temples stand. But something essential has shifted. The old guarantees no longer guarantee anything. The sky does not respond reliably. Rituals no longer feel transactional. The relationship between effort and result has broken down subtly, leaving people uncertain how much more they should give. This is the first true psychological fracture within the Maya world. A crack not in stone or soil, but in faith itself. Once that crack appears, systems dependent on shared belief become vulnerable in new ways. As faith thins, cooperation becomes harder to sustain. When people doubt outcomes, trust between groups weakens. Shared sacrifice feels riskier when returns are uncertain. The disappointment spreading quietly through ceremonies prepares the ground for something more destabilizing than drought alone. Belief no longer absorbs stress efficiently. Pressure begins to move laterally, between communities, between elites, between neighbors. This sets the stage for internal tension, not yet war, but separation. The unraveling does not begin with violence. It begins with belief growing tired, and where belief weakens, unity soon follows. Violence did not arrive at the Maya cities as an invading army. There were no foreign banners on the horizon, no sudden flood of unfamiliar weapons. Instead, tensions surfaced quietly from within. Stone walls rose not at the edges of cities, but inside them. Defensive structures appeared where rituals once flowed freely. Noble compounds hardened, designed less for ceremony and more for separation. What had been open space became controlled space. The city did not prepare for outsiders. It prepared for itself. Archaeological traces reveal a subtle but telling shift. Fortifications cut across familiar routes. Access points narrowed. Movement became managed. These changes were not grand declarations of war. They were precautions, responses to unease rather than open threat. The Maya were not fighting foreigners. They were beginning to safeguard resources, symbols, and authority from neighbors who shared language, gods, and history. That shift alone marks a profound break in how people understood community. Trust, once assumed, now required reinforcement through stone and distance. Inscriptions tell a parallel story. Earlier carvings celebrated lineage, alliances, cosmic events. Over time, language changes. Records begin emphasizing punishment, capture, control. Kings are shown restraining rivals rather than honoring shared ritual cycles. Elite conflict becomes visible, but not expansive. These were not empire-shattering wars. They were rivalries between factions, disputes over legitimacy, resource control, or declining authority. Power fragmented because belief no longer unified it. When outcomes became unreliable, allegiance followed results, not tradition. Importantly, this internal conflict followed environmental strain. It did not precede it. For centuries, the Maya managed competition within stable systems. What changed was context. Scarcity altered incentives. When resources tightened, cooperation demanded trust. Trust had already thinned under disappointment. Elites, once bound together by shared cosmic purpose, now competed to preserve their own security. Unity became conditional. Cities grew tense, not because enemies threatened existence, but because survival felt less collective than before. Violence increased unevenly, region by region. Some cities fortified quickly, others lagged, holding to older assumptions longer. This unevenness shattered regional cohesion. Instead of coordinated response, communities isolated. People retreated into familiar networks, protecting families and patrons rather than civic identity. The idea of the city as shared future weakened. When cohesion fades, even small disputes carry disproportionate force. Conflict did not explode, it multiplied. Many small tensions replaced a few large ones. This diffusion made danger harder to name, but more pervasive. For ordinary people, the experience felt unsettling rather than catastrophic. Markets still opened, rituals still occurred, but movement felt watched, access became restricted. Rumors spread faster than certainty. When leadership competed instead of cooperated, confidence drained from the system like water through hidden cracks. People sensed that collective survival was no longer guaranteed. The city no longer felt unquestionably safe. And when safety feels uncertain, loyalty becomes selective. This is how social collapse begins quietly, without dramatic revolt. The most significant shift was psychological. Communities stopped believing in shared destiny. The idea that everyone's fate was bound together weakened under strain. When cooperation became risky and returns uncertain, people recalculated. Survival instincts, long suppressed by structure and routine, resurfaced gently rather than violently. Households focused inward. Alliances narrowed. Identity contracted. What once held people together now asked too much for too little certainty. This withdrawal did not look like rebellion. It looked like caution. Evidence supports this reading. There is little sign of widespread destruction associated with these conflicts. Temples were not razed. Cities were not burned. Instead, defensive adjustments suggest anticipation, not chaos. This was not civil war in the dramatic sense. It was fragmentation. A steady erosion of cooperation that made maintaining large urban centers increasingly difficult. Complexity requires trust. Once trust declines, complexity becomes liability. Cities rely on shared effort to sustain water systems, rituals, markets, and authority. When participation wanes, systems strain under their own weight. Importantly, elites were not immune. They competed precisely because authority had become fragile. When belief cannot guarantee obedience, power seeks reinforcement through control. This creates feedback. Control increases resentment. Resentment increases fragmentation. The Maya cities entered this cycle slowly, almost invisibly. Leadership struggled to hold structures together through means that once felt unnecessary. The result was not unity, but pressure. Cities grew tense internally, focused on managing dissent rather than cultivating belonging. This internal stress explains something long misunderstood. Maya collapse was not caused by armies overrunning cities after disaster weakened them. Violence followed instability. It did not cause it. The real damage occurred earlier, when shared identity eroded. Once people stop believing their survival is collective, cities lose purpose. Urban life demands cooperation beyond necessity. When necessity becomes personal rather than communal, cities empty even without destruction. People leave not because walls fall, but because meaning does. The real enemy, then, was not outside. It was the slow withdrawal of trust. It was the sense that effort no longer ensured safety for everyone. As conflict remained localized and fragmented, the option of departure grew quietly attractive. Why remain inside systems requiring constant negotiation, tension, and vigilance when alternatives existed beyond walls? Cities once symbolized protection and belonging. Now they symbolized effort without assurance. This shift prepared minds for a decision far more radical than reform. As social cohesion weakened, survival instincts rose to the surface. People began considering futures that did not depend on civic identity or monumental centers. The city ceased to feel like destiny. It became a choice. And once something foundational becomes optional, its grip loosens quickly. What follows is not conquest or revolution, but movement, quiet calculation, families choosing distance over defense. The fracture within the city opens the path toward an unexpected solution: leaving. By the time the choice emerged, it did not feel dramatic. It felt practical. The most unsettling realization in the Maya story is not that cities were abandoned, but that leaving worked. Life continued beyond temples and plazas, not in diminished form, but adapted. People did not disappear into wilderness unprepared. They redistributed themselves, thinning density, breaking complexity into smaller, manageable pieces. What historians once described as collapse begins to look different when viewed from ground level. It resembles release. Evidence shows that while great city centers emptied, populations did not vanish at the same scale. Rural settlements persisted. Small communities endured along rivers, hills, and forest edges. Agriculture continued. Knowledge was carried with people rather than locked inside stone. This matters deeply. If abandonment had meant death, desperation, or extinction, the story would end there. Instead, it bends. Urban density declined, but survival rates stabilized. People lived differently, not worse. What failed was the model of civilization they had built, not their ability to exist. Migration, in this context, was not panic. It unfolded gradually, household by household. Families left behind monumental architecture not because they were forced out, but because those structures no longer justified their cost. Temples demanded labor, cities demanded coordination, ritual demanded belief. Beyond city limits, life required fewer promises. Fields could be smaller, authority closer, decisions faster. Risk became personal rather than systemic. This shift reduced dependence on fragile networks. In a world where trust in large systems had thinned, simplicity offered resilience. The idea that civilization became optional challenges deeply rooted assumptions. We are conditioned to believe complex societies represent progress without alternative. The Maya suggest otherwise. They demonstrate that complexity is a strategy, not a destiny. When conditions support it, complexity flourishes. When conditions change, complexity becomes a burden. Abandonment, then, is not failure of imagination. It is imagination applied pragmatically. People chose environments where effort aligned more directly with outcome, where survival depended less on ritual performance and elite negotiation, and more on daily work and immediate community. Crucially, this was not a single exodus. Different regions responded differently. Some communities lingered near old centers, others moved farther. The process unfolded across generations, allowing knowledge transfer rather than rupture. Children grew up in worlds without vast plazas, but with inherited skills. Identity shifted. Being Maya no longer required living in a massive city. It required memory, language, and practice. Civilization's symbols faded, but culture endured. That distinction often vanishes in historical summaries, yet it defines what truly survived. What makes this realization unsettling is how rational it feels. Leaving reduced exposure to drought's worst effects by distributing populations across varied microclimates, smaller communities required less water, less coordination, less constant reassurance. Social tension eased when competition for centralized power diminished. Life became quieter, narrower, perhaps less grand, but also less brittle. From the inside, this likely felt like relief rather than defeat. People exchanged monumental certainty for practical stability. History later called this disappearance. The people living it likely called it necessity. This reframing produces the first real cognitive jolt. Abandonment was not collapse in the way we imagine collapse. It was adaptation. The Maya did not lose control of their world overnight. They renegotiated their relationship with it. When cities stopped offering security and meaning proportionate to their demands, people stepped away. Walking away preserved life. Staying might not have. In evolutionary terms, this is success, not loss. Survival favored those willing to let go of impressive structures when those structures no longer served them. Of course, this decision carried emotional cost. Leaving a city meant leaving ancestors' monuments, sacred alignments, spaces filled with memory. It meant accepting that permanence was no longer viable. That choice would not have been easy. It was likely accompanied by grief, hesitation, and debate. But it did not require rebellion or destruction. Cities emptied without being defiled. Temples remained standing, respected, but unused. This suggests departure carried intention, even reverence. People did not reject their past. They carried the parts they needed forward. Over time, what remained were silhouettes in the forest. Structures designed for thousands stood empty, while small communities elsewhere adapted invisibly. This inverted the logic of historical visibility. The most successful response left the least trace. Archaeology struggles with absence, because absence does not announce itself. Stone does, cities do. Survival, when quiet, often looks like failure from a distance. But the Maya story insists on a different reading. It asks whether endurance always needs monuments to be real. This is where the story turns decisively. If leaving was deliberate, then what vanished is not a people, but a form. Civilization, as built around dense cities and centralized ritual power, became one option among others. When it stopped working, it was abandoned without shame, without spectacle. That choice preserved human life at the expense of historical memory. We inherited the ruins, not the reasoning. Only now are we beginning to see that reasoning clearly. If people chose to leave, then the story cannot stay among ruins. It must follow those who walked into the margins, beyond written record, beyond monumental space, into forests, villages, rivers, and oral memory. The next chapter leaves stone behind and traces what survived without it. Because disappearance, in this case, was not the end. It was the method. A city does not vanish all at once. It is unlived slowly, through decisions that feel small while they are happening. Doors close and are not reopened. Courtyards echo a little longer than before. Fires are lit less often. In the Maya cities, abandonment did not arrive with urgency or fear. It unfolded carefully, shaped by familiarity rather than panic. People left behind places they knew intimately, not as refugees fleeing danger, but as residents concluding a chapter. Homes were not destroyed. They were undone. Usable materials were removed piece by piece, carried away to new settlements where they would live again in different forms. Stones did not tumble. They were lifted. Beams were reused. Tools followed hands that still needed them. What remained was not wreckage, but shells. Structures without purpose, emptied respectfully, as if departure itself required dignity. This practical dismantling tells us something important. Leaving was planned. It allowed time for thought, memory, and intention to shape the final moments. Temples, too, were not vandalized. They were closed. Archaeological evidence suggests ritual activity continued even as cities emptied, but its purpose shifted. Ceremonies no longer asked the gods to restore balance. They marked endings. Spaces, once alive with movement and sound, were sealed symbolically, their power acknowledged rather than rejected. To leave without closure would have felt dangerous in a world governed by meaning. So, rituals accompanied departure, not to cling to the city, but to release it. Faith adapted to the reality of leaving, rather than resisting it. For families, abandonment was intimate. It meant choosing what to carry and what to leave behind. It meant explaining to children why familiar routines would end. It meant final walks across plazas filled with memory. These were not empty places yet. People still lived there as departure unfolded. Laughter, conversation, and uncertainty shared the same spaces where rituals once guaranteed order. The decision to leave did not erase attachment. It transformed it into something quieter, carried forward, rather than anchored in stone. Nothing suggests haste. There are no signs of mass fires meant to deny return. No scorched temples signaling rejection. Instead, cities appear paused. Houses were left orderly. Personal items vanished, not scattered. These details indicate trust that what mattered could move with people. The city itself was no longer the vessel for survival or identity. It was released, as one releases something that no longer fits but is still respected. In this way, abandonment became a final act of participation rather than rebellion. One of the most haunting aspects of this process is how deliberate it feels. Leaving required coordination. People did not depart randomly. Networks shifted outward, redistributing population into smaller communities that could support themselves with less strain. This suggests communication, planning, and shared understanding. Abandonment was not a collapse of social order, it was its reorganization. The city, once a center, became optional. That realization spread quietly until staying felt less sensible than going. The language of archaeology struggles here because it expects noise. It looks for destruction layers, fractures, chaos. What it finds instead is emptiness. Emptiness is often mistaken for failure because it leaves no spectacle. Yet emptiness in this context represents resolution. People finished what they needed to finish, then walked away. They did not expect the city to die dramatically. They expected it to wait, as it now has for centuries, holding outlines of a life that moved on deliberately. As buildings emptied, sound changed. Footsteps thinned. Markets quieted. Paths gathered leaves instead of traffic. Night returned more fully, unbroken by ritual fires. These sensory shifts mattered deeply. Leaving was not abstract. It was felt in the body as familiarity dissolved. Still, people chose movement over stagnation. Staying inside an emptying city would have been lonelier than leaving it behind together. Community survived by relocating, not by clinging to structures that demanded constant participation no longer available. abandonment also carried risk. Leaving meant uncertainty, vulnerability, exposure. People traded known systems for smaller, less centralized ones. This suggests confidence not in place, but in skills. Agriculture, knowledge of land, language, belief these were portable. Stone was not. By leaving cities intact, the Maya demonstrated what they valued most. Life mattered more than legacy. Survivability mattered more than memory carved into monuments. That choice contradicts many assumptions about ancient ambition and pride. From a distance, these cities appear deserted abruptly. From within, departure unfolded as a series of ordinary days, shaped by irreversible direction. There was no single farewell moment recorded in stone. Goodbyes happened privately, inside households, during rituals meant for those who understood their meaning. The city did not watch itself empty. It simply found fewer footsteps to support. Eventually, even echoes retreated. What remained was form without function, waiting for something else to arrive. Once the last households left, the city entered a new phase of existence. It became space without intention, without maintenance, without voices to correct small failures. Roofs sagged. Vines found edges left unattended. Cracks widened slowly under sun and rain. The processes that once required human effort ceased, replaced by others that did not wait for permission. Abandonment completed itself, not when the last person left, but when nature noticed the absence. This moment marks a transformation rather than an ending. A city unlived becomes something else entirely. It no longer responds to human schedules or meaning. It begins responding to light, moisture, roots, and time. With people gone, the jungle steps closer, patient and thorough. The breach between stone and forest closes quietly. What follows is not destruction, but absorption. The next stage of the story begins when the human voice fades completely, and another presence takes over, ready to reclaim what was left behind. When the last footsteps faded, the forest did not rush in. It waited. There was no sudden collapse into green chaos, no single season when vines overwhelmed plazas overnight. Nature does not conquer the way armies do. It arrives by patience, measuring time differently than people ever have. The Maya cities were not destroyed by the jungle. They were absorbed, slowly folded back into a world that never stopped watching them. At first, the changes were subtle. Leaves gathered where feet once passed daily. Seeds settled into cracks left uncleaned. Moisture lingered longer on stone surfaces, no longer warmed by human presence. Roofs sagged quietly under rain they were built to withstand only with care. Without repair, small failures multiplied, not dramatically, but inevitably. Roots followed water, vines followed light. Soil accumulated grain by grain. The absence of hands reshaping the environment allowed other forces to resume their work. Over time, structures softened, edges blurred, straight lines bent into suggestion. A temple did not fall, it dissolved into scaffolding for life. Trees rose through stairways as though invited. Roots wrapped stone not to break it apart, but to hold it in place, stitching architecture back into earth. This process took centuries, not years, long enough that memory faded faster than buildings. The forest did what it always does. It filled space. It claimed stillness. It normalized absence until human absence felt like the natural order again. From above, cities disappeared before they vanished. Canopies concealed shapes while walls still stood intact beneath. Plazas became clearings only the sky could recognize. Roads turned into lines of deeper green, detectable only to those who knew how to look. The forest did not erase evidence, it hid it. This distinction matters. Erasure suggests destruction. Hiding suggests preservation, waiting. The Maya world did not shatter into ruin. It slipped under a living cover, patient enough to outlast attention. This invisibility reshaped historical memory. Later observers did not see a transformed landscape. They saw wilderness. Absence was mistaken for emptiness. Silence interpreted as extinction. The forest seemed to imply the Maya had vanished entirely, absorbed as completely as their cities. But disappearance of visibility is not disappearance of people. That assumption arises because we privilege stone over survival. Forests are rarely read as archives, yet they remember everything they cover. The jungle kept what humans forgot. Beneath roots and soil, Foundations remained aligned with stars no one measured anymore. Reservoirs filled with sediment rather than water, their forms intact beneath new surfaces. The forest did not judge these works obsolete. It simply incorporated them. In doing so, it severed human memory from human presence. Cities left behind without caretakers become unreadable, even when preserved. Meaning dissolves faster than material. This is how forgetting happens, not through loss, but through silence sustained long enough to feel complete. Yet disappearance was never total. While cities slept beneath leaves, people lived elsewhere. Knowledge adapted, language shifted. Farming practices carried forward into smaller clearings. Forest and human life re-entered conversation, not as opposing forces, but as mutual negotiators. The Maya did not disappear into trees. They repositioned themselves within them. This distinction rewrites the story entirely. It replaces collapse with relocation. It replaces extinction with adaptation too quiet to record in monuments. For centuries, the forest protected what people left behind. It dulled edges. It concealed alignments. It kept cities from being repurposed or dismantled further. Ironically, abandonment preserved them better than continued use might have. The absence of roads prevented looting. The lack of maintenance allowed growth to stabilize rather than collapse structures. Nature became custodian rather than destroyer. The forest did not erase stone to forget it. It erased stone to live alongside it. When explorers eventually stumbled upon these places again, they mistook revelation for discovery. Ruins emerged as though resurrected from oblivion, but they had never left. They were simply unseen. Forgotten things feel lost until remembered again. The jungle created this illusion of disappearance, shaping narratives of mystery that persist today. We marvel at rediscovered cities without questioning why they waited so patiently to be found. Their waiting suggests something powerful, that absence and presence are not opposites, but phases. The forest also teaches a deeper lesson about scale. Human timelines move quickly, impatiently. We measure success in permanence, measured by decades or centuries. Nature measures endurance differently. Stone that lasts 1,000 years is temporary to a tree that will outlive memory itself. The forest reasserted this hierarchy without violence. It did not attack civilization, it outlasted it. This reverses the usual narrative of collapse, where nature acts as antagonist. Here, nature is continuity itself, reminding us that disappearance often reflects shifting priorities, not failure. As vines closed over stairways and soil softened plazas into earth, the cities stopped asking for attention. They did not announce their significance. They waited. This waiting challenges us. It asks whether meaning requires visibility, whether history must remain accessible to matter. The Maya cities suggest otherwise. They endured as shapes and lessons long after people moved forward. They survived by stepping out of human time and into environmental time, where waiting is not weakness, but strategy. The forest that erased stone created the illusion of an ending. It taught outsiders to equate absence with annihilation. Yet nothing here ended. It transformed. The Maya did not become ghosts of the jungle. They became quieter participants in it. Disappearance was situational, not absolute. What vanished were cities designed for an earlier world. What remained were people, skills, memories, carried in forms not easily excavated. This realization shifts the story forward. If forgetting was temporary, then loss was incomplete. The jungle did not bury a civilization. It concealed evidence of a choice. And choices can be revisited, reinterpreted, understood differently from each generation's perspective. As we move onward, the narrative leaves ruins behind and follows continuity instead of collapse. The next chapter emerges from beneath the leaves, revealing not what ended, but what endured quietly beyond stone and shadow all along. When the cities fell quiet beneath the forest, something essential continued moving. It did not announce itself with monuments or inscriptions. It did not wait to be discovered. It moved through voices, habits, fields, and memory. The Maya did not vanish with their stone cities. They changed scale. They traded visibility for continuity, and in doing so, preserved far more than ruins ever could. Language endured first. Words passed from parent to child, adjusting shape but retaining meaning. Sounds shifted, accents diverged, yet the core survived. Through language traveled history, instruction, humor, and warning. Place names carried memory of water sources. Plant names preserved ecological knowledge refined over generations. Speech became archive. Unlike stone, it could move when conditions demanded. As cities emptied, language walked with the people, carrying identity lightly enough to survive in smaller spaces. Farming followed a similar path. Large-scale urban agriculture gave way to flexible, localized methods. Knowledge of soil, rain patterns, forest cycles, and crop diversity adapted to changing conditions. Instead of depending on vast reservoirs and coordinated labor, communities relied on mixed planting, seasonal awareness, and intimate familiarity with land variation. This was not regression. It was refinement. Small systems proved resilient where large ones had grown brittle. Fields adjusted to microclimates. Crops diversified instead of concentrating. Food security returned not through abundance, but adaptability. Oral memory preserved what stone no longer displayed. Stories replaced stelae. Ritual meaning traveled inside narrative rather than architecture. Myths encoded history, survival strategies, moral instruction. What was once carved into temples lived on through repetition around fires and fields. Oral tradition does not freeze time, it reshapes it. Each retelling adapts emphasis without losing core truths. In this way, memory stayed alive rather than fixed. The Maya past was not erased. It was carried, revised, just enough to remain useful. Community structure changed but did not dissolve. Smaller groups required trust built through proximity rather than spectacle. Leadership became situational rather than divine. Authority aligned more closely with experience and skill. Those who knew land, seasons, and healing gained influence. Social cohesion returned through shared labor rather than centralized ritual obligation. Survival no longer required cosmic mediation. It required attentiveness. People learned to listen again, not to the heavens alone, but to terrain, plants, and weather that could no longer be negotiated through ceremony. This transformation challenges the assumption that civilization only exists at monumental scale. The Maya world demonstrates another possibility. A civilization can contract without ending. It can release complexity while preserving knowledge. This form of survival leaves fewer artifacts, but it leaves people alive. From an archaeological perspective, this looks like disappearance. From a human perspective, it looks like endurance. The difference lies in what we choose to measure. We see stone. The Maya valued life. Across generations, these adapted communities endured droughts, political changes, and eventually foreign contact. When outsiders arrived centuries later, they did not encounter absence. They encountered living Maya populations speaking related languages, practicing refined agriculture, and maintaining belief systems altered but intact. The supposed collapse had not destroyed continuity. It had restructured it. What fell were cities designed for a specific balance that no longer held. What survived were people capable of adjusting when balance shifted. This recognition transforms our understanding of the earlier story. The abandonment of cities was not the end of Maya civilization. It was its evolution. Civilization did not shatter. It shed weight. It learned to move through environments that no longer supported monumental permanence. Stone failed not because it was weak, but because it demanded stability impossible to maintain. Knowledge demanded flexibility, and flexibility endured. Even today, the Maya presence persists across regions once thought abandoned. Traditions evolve, languages diversify, but continuity remains visible to those who look beyond ruins. The forest that hid cities did not absorb people. It hosted them. Human life wove back into ecological rhythms with fewer demands and more responsiveness. This reintegration blurred boundaries between civilization and environment, rather than reinforcing them through architecture and control. So the question turns: can a civilization truly end if its people endure? If memory, practice, and adaptation survive, what has actually been lost? Perhaps only a form. This reframing forces a re-evaluation of collapse narratives everywhere. We confuse the disappearance of symbols with the disappearance of life. The Maya story demonstrates that these are not the same. Loss of visibility is not loss of existence. Sometimes survival requires becoming harder to see. Understanding this continuity reframes everything that came before. The tension, the pressure, the internal fragmentation no longer appear as failures leading to extinction. They appear as signals prompting change. The Maya listened. They adjusted course rather than holding fast to a structure unwilling to bend. That choice preserved what mattered most. Life continued beyond stone. Knowledge traveled without walls. Identity endured without plazas. Once survival is understood this way, the ruins take on a different meaning. They are not remains of a dead civilization, but markers of a decision. They stand as evidence of restraint rather than defeat. To walk away from stone requires confidence that value lies elsewhere. The Maya made that choice, and because they did, the story does not end beneath the jungle canopy. It continues, reshaping how we define endurance, success, and what it truly means for a civilization to survive. For centuries, the Maya story has been told through a narrow lens, shaped far from the forests where it unfolded. Western history prefers clean endings. Civilizations rise, peak, and fall, preferably with spectacle. Fire, invasion, disease, conquest. These markers reassure us that the past behaves according to rules we recognize. The Maya refuse this structure. Their cities stand empty but intact, their people absent yet alive elsewhere. Faced with this contradiction, early interpretations chose the explanation that fit expectation rather than evidence. Collapse became the label. Silence became failure. This misunderstanding began with monuments. Archaeology privileges what remains visible, measurable, dramatic. Stone speaks loudly to those trained to listen for it, while absence feels like loss. When explorers and scholars first encountered Maya ruins, they saw abandonment and assumed extinction. They did not see migration paths, oral memory, or adaptive farming hidden beyond city centers. The narrative formed quickly. A great civilization destroyed itself through excess or mystery. Survival beyond stone was inconvenient, difficult to frame, and easily dismissed because it left fewer artifacts to display. Western frameworks also struggled with the idea that people might choose to leave complexity behind. Progress is typically imagined as a one-way ascent. To step down appears regressive. The Maya challenged this belief directly. Their decision undermines the assumption that larger, denser, more monumental societies always represent advancement. When historians framed abandonment as collapse, they projected their own hierarchy of values onto a culture that measured success differently. The Maya prioritized endurance over display. That choice did not fit neatly into prevailing models, so it was misread. Even language reveals bias. Words like collapse, decline, and disappearance imply failure by default. They frame change as loss rather than strategy. Yet the archaeological record increasingly shows continuity rather than rupture. Populations persisted, knowledge adapted, culture transformed. What ended was not civilization itself, but a specific configuration of it. Western narratives mistook form for essence. They equated cities with people, monuments with identity, architecture with survival. When those symbols faded, meaning was assumed to fade with them. This misinterpretation also served comfort. External explanations are reassuring. It is easier to attribute failure to drought, invasion, or divine displeasure than to consider voluntary withdrawal as wisdom. Catastrophe absolves observers from reflection. Choice demands comparison. If the Maya left when systems grew unsustainable, it raises uncomfortable questions about societies that refuse to consider doing the same. Labeling the past a failure preserves the illusion that progress must continue forward, regardless of cost. Over time, evidence complicated the story. Linguistic persistence, genetic continuity, living Maya communities, maintaining traditions long after the so-called collapse. Each discovery strained the old narrative, yet it lingered because it was deeply embedded. Museums, textbooks, documentaries repeated the image of a vanished people. The ruins inspired awe precisely because they were framed as relics of extinction. Mystery sells well, survival without spectacle does not, and so the misunderstanding endured, reinforced by repetition rather than accuracy. Correcting this view requires reframing what civilization means. If we define it narrowly as dense urbanism, monumental scale, and centralized power, then yes, Maya cities collapsed. But if civilization is defined by shared knowledge, social continuity, and adaptive survival, then the Maya endured with remarkable success. The problem lies not in their story, but in our definitions. We confuse permanence of structure with permanence of culture. When buildings disappear, we assume meaning must disappear too. This matters because narratives shape lessons. If we believe the Maya failed due to mysterious flaws, their story becomes cautionary in a familiar way. If we recognize that they chose survival over form, the lesson changes. It becomes unsettling. It suggests that walking away from complexity can be intelligent rather than tragic. It reframes endurance as flexibility instead of dominance. That perspective threatens modern assumptions built on endless growth and symbolic permanence. Understanding the Maya correctly requires humility. It requires accepting that history does not always move toward larger, louder systems. Sometimes it moves sideways, inward, or outward into spaces historians overlook. The Maya did not disappear because they could not adapt. They survived because they did. Their cities remain as evidence of what they built. Their people remain as evidence of what they chose. Once this reframing takes hold, the ruins stop looking like graves. They look like signposts, marking a choice made long ago. A choice to prioritize human life over monumental continuity. A choice to abandon symbols when symbols demanded too much. Western narratives missed this because they looked for endings, not decisions. They asked how the Maya fell, instead of why they moved. This misunderstanding reveals more about those telling the story than those living it. History often reflects the anxieties of the present. We are drawn to tales of collapse because they reassure us that failure looks dramatic and unmistakable. The Maya show us something quieter. That survival can look like disappearance. That success can look like withdrawal. That enduring civilizations are not always the ones that leave the most stone behind. With this correction, the story shifts. It no longer asks what destroyed the Maya. It asks what they understood before others did. It asks why abandoning form preserved essence. It asks whether history has been reading the wrong signals all along. This realization carries weight beyond archaeology. It turns the narrative inward, toward the present. Now that the Maya are no longer framed as a cautionary tale of failure, a different question rises. What does their choice say about societies that refuse to reconsider their structures? What happens when we mistake endurance for immobility? With the past clarified, the story becomes reflective. It turns from them to us, asking what we might misunderstand about our own permanence and what survival might demand when systems stop listening. When we hear the word collapse, our minds rush toward images of chaos, burning cities, fleeing crowds, a sharp line between before and after. Collapse, in modern imagination, is violent and final. It leaves scars meant to warn future generations not to repeat the same mistakes. But the Maya story resists this image at every turn. Nothing exploded, nothing ended all at once. What we call collapse looks far more like a slow change in shape, a quiet reorganization of life that historians later struggled to recognize for what it was. If we strip away the expectation of spectacle, a different picture emerges. Maya society did not vanish. It redistributed. Power loosened rather than shattered. Population spread outward instead of compressing inward. Knowledge shifted mediums, moving from stone to voice, from monument to memory. The forms changed, but the substance endured. This is not annihilation, it is transformation. The difficulty lies in our habit of noticing only what stops, not what continues differently. Collapse assumes failure. Transformation assumes response. The Maya faced conditions that made their existing structures costly rather than supportive. Instead of forcing those structures to continue at all expense, people adapted by releasing them. In doing so, they preserved flexibility. What collapsed was not life, but a particular configuration of life that no longer aligned with reality. Seen this way, Maya abandonment becomes less a cautionary tale and more a case study in restraint. Part of the confusion comes from scale. Large systems leave large traces. When they fade, the absence feels dramatic. Smaller systems leave little behind, even when they succeed. Archaeology is better at finding cities than finding choices. It can catalogue ruins, but it struggles to capture decisions made quietly over generations. As a result, history often privileges the moment when something stops being visible, rather than the moment when something adapts. Collapse appears sudden only because the transition moved beneath the threshold we're trained to observe. This reframing forces us to examine how definitions shape interpretation. If civilization is defined by cities, collapse seems obvious. If it is defined by continuity of people, language, and practice, collapse becomes mislabeling. The Maya challenge us to separate civilization from its architecture. Stone was their expression, not their essence. When stone stopped serving, they let it go. That ability to detach form from meaning may have been their greatest strength, not their failure. Transformation rarely feels triumphant from the outside. It lacks heroes and villains. It unfolds without ceremony. Those living through it may not even recognize it as historical. They are responding to conditions, not performing for posterity. The Maya did not call their experience collapse. They likely experienced it as adjustment, as pragmatism, as choosing what allowed life to continue with less tension. Our language imposes drama where they practice discernment. There is also an emotional component to the word collapse. It suggests loss beyond recovery. But the Maya story preserves continuity across centuries. Living Maya communities today are not revivals of a dead civilization. They are its continuation in altered form. That fact alone destabilizes the collapse narrative. You cannot resurrect what never fully ended. You can only notice what you failed to see before. This matters because how we interpret the past directs how we prepare for the future. If we believe collapse arrives as catastrophe, we wait for unmistakable signs. If it arrives as transformation, the signs are quieter. They appear as strain, fatigue, inefficiency, and diminishing returns. They ask for re-evaluation rather than resistance. The Maya responded to those signs not by doubling down endlessly, but by stepping away when persistence became dangerous. Seen this way, collapse becomes a misleading label for what is essentially adaptive failure avoidance. Systems do not always die. Sometimes they are retired, sometimes they are outgrown. Sometimes they are set aside so that people can continue elsewhere. That decision does not leave behind dramatic markers. It leaves behind ruins that confuse later observers who expect clear endings. Rethinking collapse also forces us to confront our attachment to permanence. We admire civilizations that leave lasting monuments because they appear to conquer time. But time always wins eventually. The Maya accepted this reality more gracefully than many. Instead of fighting to preserve form at increasing cost, they chose survival in changing conditions. They let time reshape their expression rather than attempting to defeat it. That choice looks like disappearance only if you mistake visibility for existence. The idea that collapse is a change in shape rather than an end unsettles deeply held beliefs. It implies that decline may not be obvious, dramatic, or universally recognized. It suggests that endurance sometimes requires letting go of what once defined success. And it raises uncomfortable questions about how often societies cling to familiar structures long after those structures cease to serve their people effectively. When viewed through this lens, the Maya story stops being ancient and distant. It becomes familiar. It looks like systems under strain everywhere, institutions growing complex, effort increasing while benefit plateaus, faith in outcomes weakening, people quietly opting out rather than revolting. This is not the language of apocalypse. It is the language of adjustment. And adjustment, when ignored, becomes invisible to those waiting for fire. The Maya did not wait for collapse to announce itself. They responded before catastrophe forced their hand. That foresight denied history the drama it prefers. Instead, it left us with ambiguity. Ambiguity frustrates simple stories, but it carries richer lessons. It teaches that survival does not always wear the mask of victory, and that endings may arrive dressed as choices rather than disasters. Once collapse is understood as transformation, not annihilation, the story opens outward. It stops pointing backward toward blame and starts pointing forward toward insight. It encourages us to look for continuity beneath apparent loss and for wisdom in withdrawal rather than stubborn persistence. This understanding prepares the ground for uncomfortable parallels. Because if the Maya transformed rather than collapsed, then their story is not safely contained in the past. It becomes a mirror. And when stories become mirrors, they ask something in return, quietly, without spectacle. It is tempting to keep the Maya safely in the past, sealed behind time and distance. Ancient forests, ancient stone, ancient choices that no longer apply. Yet when their story is laid out carefully, the distance begins to shrink. The pressures they faced do not feel unfamiliar. Climate uncertainty, systems growing heavier, belief strained by inconsistency, effort increasing while reassurance fades. These echoes reach forward quietly, not as warning sirens, but as patterns repeating under different names. Like the Maya, we live inside systems built for stability rather than flexibility. Our cities expand outward, consuming land and resources with confidence shaped by previous success. Each solution works just well enough to justify expansion. Technology becomes insurance. Engineering buys time. Complexity deepens, promising control while silently increasing dependence. From the inside, it feels like progress. From a long view, it begins to resemble weight. Nothing collapses. Everything continues, louder and faster, asking more energy just to remain functional. Climate stress, too, mirrors the past in unsettling ways. Change does not arrive as a single catastrophe. It arrives unevenly. Seasons shift. Extremes fluctuate. Recovery remains possible until it doesn't. Like the Maya, modern societies adapt repeatedly. We build protections, reroute supply chains, reinforce infrastructure. Each adjustment succeeds partially, reinforcing confidence that ingenuity will continue saving us from limits. But each adjustment also narrows margin. It replaces resilience with effort. Effort can sustain systems for long periods. It rarely restores balance indefinitely. Belief strain follows close behind. Not religious belief alone, but faith in institutions, narratives, and guarantees. Systems promise stability, growth, security. When outcomes no longer align with promises, confidence bends. The response often mirrors the Maya pattern. More visibility, more reassurance, louder declarations that order is intact. Leaders emphasize continuity, while uncertainty slips through daily life. Belief does not disappear quickly. It stretches, absorbs pressure, adapts explanations. But belief asked to carry too much for too long begins to tire. Like the ancient world, this strain does not erupt as universal rebellion. It fragments. Different communities experience pressure differently. Some adapt successfully, others struggle earlier. This unevenness prevents unified response. It encourages local solutions rather than collective ones. People recalibrate expectations quietly. They disengage selectively. They opt out of complexity where possible, simplifying lives, narrowing obligations, seeking smaller systems they feel can still respond to effort directly. From a distance, these choices appear as apathy or retreat. Up close, they look like self-preservation. The most uncomfortable parallel lies in how success becomes a trap. Modern systems, like ancient ones, are built from solutions that once worked beautifully. The problem is not incompetence. It is success extended too long without recalibration. Complexity accumulates faster than trust. Coordination costs rise. Small disruptions ripple widely. When systems require constant negotiation simply to function, people begin imagining alternatives. They do not always rebel. Often, they withdraw. They choose smaller scales, lower visibility, fewer promises. This withdrawal is difficult to measure, just as it was among the Maya. What makes these echoes unsettling is their subtlety. We expect collapse to announce itself dramatically. We wait for unmistakable signals. But the Maya teach us that transformation rarely asks permission to be noticed. It moves through ordinary choices. It looks like career changes, relocation, disengagement, simplification. None of these resemble catastrophe. Together, they reshape societies quietly. Only later do observers realize that something foundational has shifted. Another disturbing parallel emerges in how history might misread our moment. Future observers may catalogue abandoned structures, obsolete systems, and faded institutions as evidence of failure rather than adaptation. They may miss the communities that persisted elsewhere, the knowledge that relocated rather than vanished, the choices that prioritized survivability over permanence. Just as the Maya were judged by their ruins instead of their endurance, we risk misunderstanding ourselves through the remnants we leave behind, rather than the lives we continue elsewhere. This is where the question sharpens. Are we asking the same questions they did, even if we use different language? Questions about how much effort a system deserves when returns diminish. Questions about whether permanence is worth endless sacrifice. Questions about when adaptation requires moving on rather than holding tighter. These are not radical questions. They are ancient ones, resurfacing whenever systems grow heavy and margins thin. The difference lies in how societies respond. The Maya did not answer these questions dramatically. They did not deliver speeches or leave manifestos. Their answer unfolded as behavior, as movement, as choice repeated, often enough to leave cities standing empty. That quiet response denied history its expected ending, but preserved human life. The modern world may face similar decisions without recognizing them as historical at all. Transformation often feels personal before it feels collective. By the time it is visible at scale, it has already happened. What complicates matters further is our attachment to narrative stability. We want progress to continue forward, complexity to increase, systems to endure. The Maya story introduces an inconvenient alternative. That sometimes survival requires releasing what once symbolized success. That growth has seasons. That wisdom can involve stepping back rather than pushing through. These ideas conflict with modern myths of endless expansion, making them easy to dismiss, even as patterns repeat knowingly. The echoes grow louder when examined this way. Climate that refuses negotiation. Belief systems strained by inconsistency. Institutions doubling down on authority. People quietly reducing dependence on complexity. None of this guarantees collapse, but it does suggest transformation underway, whether acknowledged or not. The Maya did not wait for certainty. They acted on accumulation of experience. By the time certainty arrived, their choice had already been made. This realization shifts the story into reflective territory. The Maya stop being an ancient case study and become a mirror, held up gently, without accusation. Their experience does not predict our future. It illuminates a pattern humanity revisits under similar pressures. Whether that pattern ends in endurance or failure depends less on scale and power than on willingness to reinterpret success. As the narrative moves forward from here, the question is no longer what happened to them. It becomes what their response reveals about adaptation itself, about knowing when systems stop serving life, about recognizing that not every ending needs to look like destruction to be meaningful. The final chapters do not offer answers, because the Maya did not offer any either. They offer something more demanding: perspective, and the uneasy realization that the past may already be whispering about choices not yet fully acknowledged. We are taught to admire endurance above all else, to stay, to hold ground, to persist, even when conditions worsen, because perseverance is framed as virtue and departure as surrender. History celebrates those who remain standing amid hardship, not those who recognize when standing no longer serves life. The Maya invite us to question this instinct gently. They suggest that wisdom does not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like refusal. Stepping away requires clarity rather than courage in the traditional sense. It demands the ability to separate identity from structure, to recognize that survival is not guaranteed by loyalty to systems that once worked. For the Maya, cities were not just places to live. They were sacred maps of meaning, binding people to gods, ancestors, and time itself. Leaving such places was not weakness. It was an act of discernment. It required acknowledging that the world those cities were designed for no longer existed in the same way. This reframing unsettles us because it contradicts the stories we tell about progress. We assume that staying proves strength, while leaving signals defeat. But the Maya story reveals another dimension of bravery. Choosing to leave meant accepting uncertainty after generations of structure. It meant trusting knowledge carried in people rather than stone. It meant prioritizing adaptability over assurance. These are not easy choices. They are quiet ones, often misunderstood by those who remain. Staying is not inherently brave, just as leaving is not inherently wise. Context matters. What makes the Maya decision remarkable is timing. They did not abandon cities at the point of total collapse, but at the point when continuing demanded more than life could safely offer. They stepped away while choice remained possible. That timing preserved agency. When systems deteriorate slowly, the temptation is to wait, to hope conditions reverse. Wisdom sometimes lies in noticing patterns before they become traps. The Maya did not dramatize their departure. They did not announce it as philosophical rebellion. They lived the decision, household by household, community by community. They loosened their attachment to a form that no longer served them. In doing so, they preserved dignity. There is humility in recognizing that no structure, however meaningful, deserves endless sacrifice. This humility allowed them to survive conditions that might have destroyed societies more committed to their own symbols. Knowing when to step away also requires releasing the idea of historical approval. The Maya could not have known how much their choice would confuse future generations. They likely did not consider how silence would be interpreted as collapse. They chose survival without concern for how it would appear centuries later. That disregard for legacy freed them to act without spectacle. Their wisdom was practical, not performative. It did not ask to be remembered correctly. It asked to be lived. This stands in sharp contrast to civilizations that cling to form long after function fades. History offers many examples of societies that fought to preserve symbols, until those symbols demanded annihilation. The Maya avoided that path, not through prediction, but through awareness. They noticed when effort no longer produced balance, when rituals repeated without results, when cities demanded maintenance without offering stability. Instead of forcing permanence, they accepted impermanence as a condition of life. There is a deeper lesson here about attachment. Humans build meaning through structures, but structures can outgrow their usefulness. Knowing when to release them requires emotional maturity at scale. It requires cultures to value life over legacy, movement over monument. Such values rarely produce dramatic narratives. They produce survival stories that unfold without clear endings. Because when survival is the goal, stories continue rather than conclude neatly. The Maya teach us that leaving can be a form of courage that history fails to praise. It lacks heroes standing defiantly atop ruins. It lacks epic battles marking the end of an era. Instead, it offers something quieter and arguably more difficult. A collective willingness to say this no longer works, and to act on that recognition without waiting for catastrophe to force the choice. That willingness preserves future possibilities at the cost of immediate recognition. This idea challenges modern instincts profoundly. We often equate progress with expansion and strength with persistence. We measure success by how long a system endures, rather than how well it serves human life. The Maya suggest a different metric. Success may lie in the ability to withdraw gracefully, preserving people even if places are lost. That perspective reframes what it means to win against time, not by defeating it, but by moving with it. Stepping away does not erase mourning. The Maya likely grieved what they left behind. Cities were not abandoned without emotion. But grief did not override judgment. Attachment did not outweigh survival. This balance is rare and difficult. It requires cultures to teach discernment over stubbornness, adaptability over pride. When such values exist, leaving becomes a strategic choice rather than a shameful admission. The question, then, becomes unavoidable. Is staying always brave? Or does bravery sometimes live in departure, in choosing uncertainty over familiar decline? The Maya answered this question through action rather than doctrine. They demonstrated that stepping away can preserve culture more effectively than defending systems that exhaust it. Their wisdom lies not in prediction, but in response. As we sit with this idea, it resists easy conclusions. It does not instruct us to abandon structures indiscriminately. It asks us to remain attentive to alignment between effort and outcome. It reminds us that endurance without meaning is hollow, and permanence without adaptability is brittle. Knowing when to step away is not an instinct. It is a learned sensitivity, cultivated through experience and reflection. This realization draws the narrative toward its final shape. If leaving can be wisdom rather than defeat, then the Maya story is not a tragedy. It is a lesson written in absence, one that challenges how we define courage, success, and survival. And if that lesson holds any power, it asks not only to be understood, but to be considered carefully, as we reflect on the systems we inhabit and the quiet choices unfolding within them. Not everyone left at the same time. While families, farmers, and smaller communities dispersed into landscapes that offered flexibility and relief, power tended to stay behind. Elites lingered within the cities long after the logic of urban life had begun to unravel. This uneven departure reveals something essential about collapse that is rarely discussed. When systems fail, it is often not the people who depend on them most who cling longest. It is those whose identity is fused to structure itself. For Maya rulers and high nobles, the city was more than a place. It was proof. Authority existed visibly through temples, monuments, ritual platforms, and carved timelines linking rulers to cosmic order. Leaving meant abandoning that proof. It meant becoming ordinary in a world where power depended on distinction. As common people recalibrated for survival, elites faced a different calculus. Survival was possible elsewhere, but power was not guaranteed there. So many remained, maintaining ritual performance long after audiences thinned. Archaeological evidence supports this divide. Late-stage activity concentrates around elite compounds and ceremonial centers, rather than residential districts. Monuments continue to be raised even as surrounding neighborhoods empty. Ritual spaces remain active despite declining populations. This persistence was not blindness, it was obligation. Elites were trapped inside the system that had elevated them. Walking away would have meant surrendering legitimacy entirely. For them, the cost of leaving felt greater than the cost of staying, even as that cost rose steadily. This pattern clarifies a misunderstanding about collapse. The system did not fail everyone equally. Those with flexibility left first. Those invested in maintaining hierarchy stayed longest, attempting to preserve meaning through repetition and authority. When leaders doubled down on ritual and monumentality, they were not resisting change out of ignorance, they were defending relevance. In human terms, this is understandable. But in systemic terms, it is fatal. Power structures that refuse to let go often become isolated, defending form long after substance drains away. Cities near the end were not thriving centers of life. They were shells animated by ceremony. They functioned symbolically rather than practically. This mattered because symbols require participation. As participation declined, rituals lost efficacy not because people rejected them openly, but because fewer lives depended upon them. Power relies on belief distributed across population. Once that distribution falters, authority becomes louder without becoming stronger. The Maya elites experienced this shift in silence, not revolt. This is why later violence, when it appears, is localized and inward. Control replaces consensus. Suppression replaces belonging. These are not signs of strength. They are symptoms of narrowing relevance. Elites sought to contain fragmentation rather than address its cause. The result was further isolation. As common people adjusted their lives beyond city boundaries, power structures collapsed inward, preserved temporarily through symbolism but disconnected from survival reality. The question then sharpens uncomfortably. Who really collapses when a system fails? Is it those who leave and endure elsewhere, or those who remain guarding empty forms? The Maya story suggests that collapse is not evenly distributed. It strikes rigidity before it strikes adaptability. Those who cannot imagine life beyond structure often suffer most when structure no longer functions. Meanwhile, those willing to redefine success escape the worst consequences quietly. This reframes abandonment once again. It was not abandonment of culture, it was abandonment of hierarchy that demanded constant input without providing collective security. Common citizens were not rejecting identity. They were preserving it in forms that required less mediation and less performance. Elites, by contrast, were tethered to visibility. Without audience or environment capable of sustaining spectacle, authority stagnated, then withered. Importantly, this dynamic is not unique to the Maya. It surfaces repeatedly across history. Power invests in continuity of form because form legitimizes it. People invest in continuity of function because function sustains them. When the two diverge, departure becomes uneven. This asymmetry is often misread as collapse from outside, because visible centers fail while dispersed life remains unseen. The narrative focuses on what stopped rather than on what continued. Understanding this distinction complicates moral judgment. It is easy to criticize elites for staying too long or doubling down, but their choices reflect structural incentives rather than personal failure. Systems reward those who defend them, even when defense accelerates decline. The Maya elites were not villains, They were participants in a system that no longer rewarded adaptation at the top. Change threatened their purpose. Staying preserved it temporarily, leaving dissolved it immediately. As cities hollowed, the remaining power structures grew increasingly fragile. Without population, ritual lost resonance. Without cooperation, authority required force. Without faith, monuments became mute. What remained was form without foundation. Collapse, in this sense, did not arrive when cities emptied. It arrived when power outlived relevance. When symbols remained without social agreement supporting them, that is when collapse became visible archaeologically, even though life had moved on elsewhere. This perspective shifts blame away from environmental catastrophe alone. Drought strained resources, climate disrupted cycles, but rigidity completed the process. Power refused to let go, and in doing so, lost its ability to serve. Those who left avoided collapse because they detached early. Those who stayed endured collapse because they could not imagine identity without structure. As the story prepares to close, this distinction matters deeply. It reframes collapse as selective rather than absolute. It reveals that endurance often belongs to those least visible to history. It cautions us against equating leadership with resilience. And it suggests that the most dangerous moment in any system's life is the point when power commits fully to preservation instead of adaptation. The Maya did not all collapse together. Some survived by moving on, others failed by holding fast. The ruins we see today record where power stayed behind, not where life continued. This realization prepares us for the final reflection. Because if collapse is uneven and survival depends on flexibility, then the real legacy of the Maya is not written in stone alone. It lives in the quiet choices history almost missed. History rarely announces its lessons clearly. It does not pause, raise its voice, or underline meaning for those who arrive later. More often, it whispers, leaving fragments that only make sense to listeners willing to slow down. The Maya story belongs firmly in this quieter register. There is no single moment where everything falls apart, no dramatic punctuation to signal what should be learned. Instead, there is absence, empty plazas, silent stairways, long stretches of time where nothing obvious happens. And it is within that quiet that the truth waits. We are conditioned to expect history to shout. Battles, disasters, sudden endings feel important because they are loud. They interrupt life violently and demand attention, but loud moments often hide what matters most. They distract us from slow processes unfolding beneath the surface. The Maya cities did not shout their ending, they receded. Their voices lowered gradually until only echoes remained. That makes them easy to misunderstand, because silence feels less instructive than spectacle. Yet silence carries information that noise cannot. The ruins teach this gently. Nothing about them demands urgency. They sit, patient, allowing interpretation to drift. Their stones do not accuse or warn, they simply endure. Visitors often project drama onto them, imagining final stands or catastrophic events. But the physical evidence resists these stories. There are no signs of frantic escape, no scars of universal violence. The quiet becomes the message itself. Something happened slowly, carefully, so carefully that it left no obvious wound for history to photograph. Silence requires a different type of attention. It asks us to notice patterns instead of moments, accumulation instead of impact. The Maya forces us to confront the possibility that the most important historical shifts do not look like turning points while they are happening. They look like normal life continuing under new conditions. Slightly harder each year, slightly less rewarding, until the effort no longer aligns with what it gives back. That imbalance does not announce itself. It settles. This is why history whispers. People living inside these moments do not experience themselves as actors in a grand narrative. They respond to daily conditions. They adjust routines. They make choices based on what feels workable. They do not name these choices collapse, adaptation, or transformation. They simply live. Only later do observers attempt to compress these living decisions into a story with a beginning and an end. In doing so, they often miss the lessons that unfolded gradually rather than decisively. The Maya example exposes a flaw in how we listen to the past. We privilege moments of destruction because they are easy to mark. Dates can be assigned. Causes can be debated. Silence frustrates this impulse. It refuses timelines. It offers no villains, no heroes, no memorable last day. Instead, it leaves behind continuity without clarity. And continuity without spectacle feels unsatisfying to audiences trained to expect resolution. But unresolved stories are often the most faithful ones. What truths, then, can only silence carry? One is that change does not need permission to occur. It does not require consensus or ceremony. It happens quietly as individual choices accumulate. Another is that survival does not always cling to visible success. The forms that persist may be subtle, distributed, and easily overlooked. History whispers this repeatedly, but we strain to hear it over our own expectations of drama and finality. Another lesson hidden in quiet is humility. The Maya did not leave declarations explaining their choice. They did not justify themselves to the future. They accepted that their actions would be misunderstood, if remembered at all. That humility contrasts sharply with cultures that tie identity to permanence and recognition. Silence suggests confidence without display. It suggests that meaning does not require witnesses across centuries. Life simply needs to continue. The whisper also cautions us against oversimplification. When stories grow quiet, we attempt to fill the gap with certainty. We invent narratives of failure or mystery rather than sitting with ambiguity. But ambiguity is not absence of meaning. It is abundance of it. The Maya story holds multiple truths at once. Environmental stress mattered. Social fragmentation mattered. Belief strain mattered. Choice mattered. None acted alone. The whisper refuses reduction. Listening to whispers also demands patience. Fast conclusions miss slow processes. In a world that values immediacy, this creates tension. We want the past to be clear so we can move on. The Maya ask us to slow instead, to consider that some lessons cannot be rushed without distortion. Their cities waited centuries to be heard properly. Even now, their lesson remains partially obscured because it challenges how we interpret success, failure, and endurance. Silence also protects uncomfortable truths. Loud stories often reinforce beliefs we already hold. Quiet ones ask us to question them. The idea that abandonment could be wisdom, that collapse could be selective, that endurance could look like withdrawal. These concepts struggle to survive in dramatic narratives. They thrive in quiet reflection. The Maya whisper them through absence rather than assertion. This is why the lesson lingers long after facts are presented. It works slowly, unsettling assumptions without forcing reaction. It invites reconsideration rather than demands agreement. Silence leaves space for reflection, and reflection allows insight to form internally rather than be imposed. History at its most profound rarely convinces, it waits. As we approach the end of this story, the volume continues to fall. There will be no final revelation that resolves tension cleanly. The Maya do not offer commands or prophecies. They offer an example preserved through restraint. Their cities remain standing not as warnings etched in flame, but as questions written in quiet stone, questions about endurance, attachment, and the courage to live differently when conditions change. The final reflection begins here, not with answers, but with attentiveness, with learning to listen for patterns that do not announce themselves, with accepting that the most consequential choices may leave the faintest trace. History whispers because shouting would reduce complexity to spectacle. The Maya remind us that survival often passes unnoticed, and that the deepest truths require silence as their carrier. Memory is not a neutral record. It is a decision. What we keep, what we retell, what we elevate into story, and stone determines how meaning survives time. The Maya understood this intuitively, even if they never left written explanations for us to follow. Their cities remind us that remembering is selective, and forgetting is not always accidental. Sometimes it is the cost of choosing life over legacy. When we stand before ruins, we assume they are warnings. Do not overreach. Do not anger the gods. Do not mismanage resources. These interpretations are comforting because they place failure safely behind us. They suggest the past collapsed because it misunderstood something we now understand better. But the Maya complicate that comfort. Their ruins do not look like reckless excess punished by fate. They look deliberate, intact, restrained. They feel less like caution signs and more like unopened letters waiting to be read carefully. The difference matters because memory shapes judgment. If ruins are warnings, then survival elsewhere is invisible. If ruins are invitations, they ask us to look beyond stone and ask who carried knowledge forward quietly. The Maya did not erase themselves from history. We erased parts of their story by choosing to remember only what was visible. Architecture endured. Adaptation did not. Memory followed stone because stone demanded attention. Living culture, moving through forests and villages, spoke more softly and was overlooked. What we remember becomes the lesson. When survival leaves few traces, it risks being misunderstood as absence. Western history often privileges dramatic visibility over subtle endurance. This bias shapes our past and our future simultaneously. We remember civilizations by their largest forms because those forms resemble our own ambitions. We forget strategies that involve shrinking, dispersing, or stepping back because they contradict our ideals of progress. Ruins ask a question whether we intend them to or not. Are they warnings, telling us what happens when societies fail, or invitations, asking us to imagine other ways of surviving that do not announce themselves through permanence? The Maya offer no answer carved in stone. They left the decision to us. Their empty cities hold space for interpretation rather than instruction. That ambiguity makes memory active rather than passive. It forces participation. Memory also simplifies. It compresses complex choices into symbols easy to transmit. The Maya are often remembered as brilliant builders who mysteriously vanished. That narrative is neat, portable, and incomplete. It ignores farmers tending scattered fields, families teaching children where water flows during dry seasons, elders carrying stories not etched in monuments. That memory prefers static artifacts over moving life. In doing so, it turns adaptation into disappearance. What we choose to remember also determines what we repeat. If we remember collapse as catastrophe, we wait for catastrophe. If we remember it as transformation, we watch for quieter signals. The Maya story encourages the second approach. Their history suggests that meaningful change often happens before systems visibly fail. It suggests that survival can look unimpressive, even disappointing, and still be effective. These are not heroic lessons. They do not flatter ambition, they challenge it. There is a humility in remembering this way. It requires accepting that some achievements were intentionally left behind. That progress is not always additive. That wisdom can involve letting forms fade so life may continue. This perspective unsettles cultures that measure worth by permanence, visibility, and scale. It asks whether what we build today deserves to be remembered, or whether its value lies in knowing when to step away from it. Ruins endure because they allow distance. They let us admire without obligation. People endured because they adapted without spectacle. Memory often chooses the former because it is easier to curate, but the latter carries lessons far more difficult to accept. It suggests that meaning does not need to be monumental to be real. It can be lived, adjusted, and eventually forgotten without losing its impact on those who lived it. The Maya remind us that memory is a mirror. It reflects the priorities of those remembering more than those being remembered. When we frame their story as collapse, we reveal our fear of letting go. When we frame it as adaptation, we reveal openness to change. Neither interpretation is inevitable. Both are choices shaped by contemporary needs. As this story reaches its end, no resolution is offered because none was left behind intentionally. The Maya did not build an ending for us to find. They built a pause, a space where cities remain while people move on. That space asks us what we value enough to carry forward, and what we might willingly leave behind if conditions change. It asks whether our own ruins will one day be mistaken for failure, or whether survival elsewhere will go unnoticed entirely. We remember what stands still more easily than what moves. Yet life has always favoured movement over monument. The forests that hid the Maya cities did not erase their people. Memory did, partially, by focusing on stone rather than adaptation. Now, that memory begins to shift. Not loudly, not conclusively, but enough to open another path of understanding. Are ruins warnings or invitations? The answer depends on how we choose to remember. If we see them as proof of failure, we will wait for collapse and fear it. If we see them as evidence of choice, we may learn to recognize transformation before it becomes unavoidable. The Maya leave us with that responsibility, to remember honestly, to listen to silence, to notice what survives without demanding recognition. We arrive at the end not with certainty, but with perspective. The cities stand, the people endured. The meaning lives somewhere between them, shaped by what we choose to notice and what we allow ourselves to learn. When the story is finally seen whole, the question changes shape. It is no longer about where the Maya went wrong, or what destroyed them, or why their cities fell silent. It becomes something far quieter and far more unsettling. The Maya did not disappear. They moved on. And in doing so, they challenged one of the deepest assumptions we carry about what endurance is supposed to look like. We are conditioned to equate survival with visibility. We believe what lasts must stand tall, remain fixed, and announce itself across time. Monuments reassure us because they seem permanent. Stone feels honest. Ruins feel like evidence. Yet the Maya story reveals a different truth. What endured was not stone, but people. What survived was not form but knowledge. What continued was not empire, but life adapting to shifting conditions without asking permission from history. Seen this way, the empty cities no longer read as tombs. They read as milestones, places where one way of living ended because another began elsewhere. The mistake lies in assuming that continuity requires staying put. The Maya demonstrate that continuity can travel, It can thin, spread, and recombine. Language shifts but remains intelligible. Farming evolves but remains rooted in understanding. Ritual transforms but still anchors meaning. Identity persists without monuments to prove it. This reframing dismantles the mystery that has lingered for generations. There is no lost civilization waiting to be rediscovered in its entirety beneath the jungle. There is no sudden vanishing that defies explanation. There is instead a long decision, unfolding across time, to prioritize survivability over display. That decision left behind remarkable cities precisely because it did not require destroying them. The Maya did not need to erase their past to move forward. They simply stepped out of it. Endurance, in this light, looks almost invisible. It leaves few dramatic traces. It does not ask to be celebrated. Moving on rarely does. It requires letting go of recognition, legacy, and certainty. It requires trusting that what matters most can be carried internally, rather than preserved externally. The Maya trusted this. They trusted skills over symbols, relationships over hierarchies, flexibility over permanence. Their success was quiet enough to be mistaken for failure by those who arrived later looking only for stone. This is why the Maya story feels unresolved to us. It refuses the ending we expect. There is no collapse to point to, no final act of heroism or ruin. There is only departure, followed by life elsewhere. History struggles with this because it resists classification. Moving on does not fit neatly into narratives of rise and fall. It suggests that civilizations are not buildings, but behaviors. And behaviors, unlike buildings, can change shape without ending. When we say the Maya disappeared, we betray our own expectations more than their reality. We reveal how dependent we are on visible markers of success. We reveal how uncomfortable we are with survival that leaves no monuments. The Maya force us to ask whether endurance must always be recognizable to outsiders, or whether its truest form is meant primarily for those living it. From their perspective, survival did not need to be seen. It needed to work. This understanding reframes the ruins themselves. They are not evidence of disappearance. They are evidence of restraint. They show that a society can walk away without burning its achievements in anger or despair. They show that letting go does not require rejection. The Maya respected what they built enough to leave it intact. That respect preserved the cities far better than struggle might have. In stepping away, they allowed time and nature to hold what they no longer needed to inhabit. What if endurance looks nothing like monuments? This question echoes backward through the entire story. It reshapes every prior assumption. It suggests that the most enduring adaptations may be the hardest to detect. That survival often avoids attention. That wisdom may choose anonymity over admiration. The Maya endured not because they conquered time, but because they submitted to it intelligently, aligning their lives with conditions, rather than forcing conditions to obey them indefinitely. This perspective does not diminish their achievements. It elevates them. It reveals a civilization capable of recognizing limits without collapsing into chaos, capable of releasing power without erasing identity, capable of choosing life over legacy. These are not simple accomplishments. They require collective sensitivity, patience, and humility, rarely credited to ancient societies. The Maya possessed these qualities, even if history failed to see them clearly for centuries. Understanding the Maya this way also returns agency to the people themselves. They were not passive victims of drought or belief failure. They were actors responding to constraints with discernment. While environmental stress mattered, it did not dictate outcome. Choice shaped survival. That choice unfolded gradually, unevenly, but decisively enough to preserve continuity. The Maya did not wait to be destroyed. They left before destruction became the only option. This reframing does not offer comfort. It removes the distance we often place between ourselves and the past. If endurance does not require monuments, then our own measures of success become questionable. If survival sometimes demands leaving behind what we invested generations building, then permanence loses its moral advantage. The Maya story suggests that what truly lasts is not what stands unmoving, but what can move when necessary. As the narrative draws toward its final breath, the meaning crystallizes. The mystery is not why the Maya disappeared. They did not. The mystery is why it took so long to understand that moving on can be an ending and a continuation at the same time. That stepping away need not signal collapse. That silence does not imply extinction. The Maya lived this truth without needing it recorded or celebrated. One final thought remains. Not about them, but about us. About how we read the past, and how we dream about the future. About whether we will recognize endurance if it arrives quietly, without monuments, without final declarations. The Maya did not leave us instructions. They left us an example, and examples do not demand imitation. They invite reflection. At the end of this story, there is no conclusion carved in stone. There is no final declaration, no sentence meant to resolve the mystery neatly and allow us to move on unchanged. The Maya did not leave us instructions, timelines, or warnings engraved for the future. They left something more difficult, a question. And questions have a way of lingering long after narratives end. When their systems stopped serving life, they did not announce collapse. They adjusted. When adjustment was no longer enough, they released what could not bend further. They did not cling to form for the sake of memory. They chose continuity without spectacle. That choice left ruins for us to interpret, and lives for them to live. The question they leave is not historical, it is human. When structures no longer return what they demand, what do we owe them? Loyalty, repair, or release? It is tempting to believe we would recognize the moment clearly, to imagine a day when systems fail loudly enough that departure feels justified, even inevitable. But the Maya teach us otherwise. Their moment did not arrive with certainty. It arrived gradually, wrapped in ordinary days, small disappointments, shrinking margins, and repeated effort that no longer restored balance. Nothing declared itself broken, nothing demanded an immediate answer, and yet the answer emerged anyway through lived experience rather than proclamation. This makes the question profoundly personal. If your world stopped working tomorrow, not dramatically but subtly, would you notice? Or would you wait for a clearer sign? Would you keep investing effort into systems that once made sense simply because they are familiar? Or would you recognize the signal beneath the noise and adjust before necessity made the choice irreversible? The Maya story suggests that the most important decisions rarely feel momentous while they are being made. They feel practical, they feel quiet, they feel unfinished. We often romanticize endurance. Staying is praised, leaving is questioned. But endurance without reflection becomes habit rather than wisdom. The Maya endured differently. They endured by letting go of what demanded too much. They endured by trusting that life, knowledge, and meaning could survive without monumental confirmation. They endured by redefining success. That reframing is uncomfortable because it removes the assurance that staying is always virtuous. Sometimes staying is simply familiar. The question they leave us with does not push toward abandonment for its own sake. It asks for attentiveness, for honesty about alignment between effort and outcome, for willingness to notice when systems persist by habit rather than purpose. It asks whether we value the continuity of life more than the continuity of form, whether we are capable of imagining futures that do not preserve everything we built, but preserve what we need most. Late at night, when noise fades and reflection sharpens, this question settles differently. It cannot be answered quickly. It resists slogans and solutions. It waits. It asks us to look at our own landscapes, real and internal, and ask where effort still produces meaning, and where it merely maintains appearance. It asks whether we are listening for whispers or waiting for shouts. The Maya do not tell us when to leave. They show us that leaving was possible before catastrophe demanded it, that there was agency in recognition rather than reaction, that silence can be a response, not a failure. Their legacy suggests that survival does not always fight for attention. Sometimes it moves quietly into places history does not follow easily. As this documentary closes, there is no final image meant to answer the question for you. There is only space. The same kind of space left between temples and trees, between abandonment and endurance. The silence that confused observers for centuries because it refused simple explanation. That silence is not emptiness. It is invitation. We can keep asking what happened to the Maya, or we can ask why their story feels relevant now. We can treat their ruins as warnings carved in loss, or as reminders that adaptation often looks unimpressive at a distance. We can wonder why it is easier to imagine collapse than change, destruction than withdrawal, endings than transformations that continue elsewhere. The question they left us with does not demand immediate action. It demands awareness. Awareness that systems are created to serve life, not the other way around. That when service becomes burden, reassessment is not betrayal. That courage sometimes wears the face of restraint rather than resistance. That wisdom may arrive unnoticed, disguised as pragmatism rather than prophecy. If your world stopped working tomorrow, would you know when to walk away? Or would you wait until leaving was no longer a choice? The Maya chose before certainty arrived. They accepted misunderstanding rather than extinction. They trusted continuity without applause. Their question survives because it cannot be answered once and forgotten. The story ends here, but the question does not. It follows us out of the ruins, beyond the forest, into the systems we inhabit every day. It waits patiently, the way history often does, not shouting for attention, but whispering, ready to be heard when we are quiet enough to listen.